Hi, and welcome to Ethnographic Imagination Basel, a series on reimagining the world from the mundane. My name is George Pomeu, and in this episode, we will talk about the concept of diaspora, what it means to live in a world defined by mobility, where the here and now are also so centrally defined by multiple elsewheres. Our guest is Ghassan Hage, whose book, The Diasporic Condition, published in 2021, explores new ways to imagine what it means to live in a life world where being in any location transcends spatial and temporal distances. So stay tuned for a conversation on how rethinking the world as inherently diasporic may help us better understand the contemporary world order. Ghassan Hage is Professor of Anthropology and Social Theory at the University of Melbourne in Australia and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. He is well known for his work on the enduring significance of race and racism in our contemporary world, but also for his work on the experiences of nationalism, migration, and multiculturalism in Australia and the Middle East. Hage is author of numerous books, which include White Nation, Fantasies of White Supremacy in a Multicultural Society, published in 2000, Against Paranoid Nationalism, Searching for Hope in a Shrinking Society, published in 2003, Alter Politics, Critical Anthropology and the Radical Imagination, published in 2015, Is Racism an Environmental Threat, published in 2017, and The Racial Politics of Australian Multiculturalism, published in 2023. Our conversation will focus today on his recent book, The Diasporic Condition, Ethnographic Explorations of the Lebanese in the World. Ghassan, we are delighted that you accepted our invite to Ethnographic Imagination Basel and look forward to being in conversation with you.
I'm equally happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, I would suggest that we get started with the basics. And for members of our audience who don't know what the diasporic is or what the diaspora is, to offer some sort of a working definition. But maybe I'll hold back just a little bit on that question and want to tell our audience members who haven't yet had the opportunity to read the Diasporic Condition that there is something quite counterintuitive, in my opinion, about the book. You think typically of the diaspora. You think about, in dominant normative terms, a nation and then members of its nation elsewhere. So in the case of the Lebanese diasporas that you're describing primarily in Australia, Venezuela, and the US, you don't start your ethnography in those places where one would typically expect you to look for diaspora. You'll start elsewhere. You start in two villages in Lebanon where actually the absences of people who migrate become generative in all kinds of ways.
Yes, well, thank you for noticing this. I mean, obviously, it has to do with my definition of diaspora. As sort of like the standard definition of diaspora is a scattering of people. And usually, sort of like we have conceptions of classical diaspora, like a Jewish diaspora or later Armenian diaspora. And it involves the sense of people who have scattered around the globe. So, in a way, in general, the study of diaspora in Lebanon has always followed the same rules that you have been describing. That is, whenever you open something about the Lebanese diaspora, it's about the Lebanese in Canada, the Lebanese in Australia, the Lebanese in the United States. So you start with the scattering. And in a way, the reason I start in the village is because I'm trying to introduce a new concept of diaspora, which is specifically what I call a modern diaspora. A diaspora connected to the culture of modernity. And that is what I'm trying to say is that in order to really understand the Lebanese diaspora, you'd have to not think it causally as a second effect of something else. Like usually, like effect one, there's a disaster, result, there's a scattering of people. Capitalism comes, it leads people to move. So what I'm trying to do is rather say that Lebanese capitalist modernity is inherently a scattering. And that's why I want to start from the start. I'll just give you a very quick example to make it sort of like vivid. In Lebanon, obviously, there's a lot of people who don't migrate. But you find something very strange, which is if you're talking to someone who hasn't migrated, they try to explain to you why they haven't migrated.
As if the expectation was
As
there.
if the expectation is that they should have gone. And sort of like, and sometimes it's kind of like a sob story, or I'm sorry, sort of like my circumstances did not allow. Sometimes it's saying, I'm someone who is proud of myself of not having migrated, but you feel that the force to propel people outside of the culture is inherent to the culture. And that is why I wanted to start from the village, because my aim is precisely to capture what I'm calling the modernity of this diaspora. It is a culture which is propelling you from outside of your country right from the start. Right.
So is this another way of also saying that certain subjects might not be mobile in the sense of, you know, being engaged with various diasporas directly and so on, but they're as much shaped by the mobility of their fellow villagers as those who actually travel?
Absolutely. I mean, there's two things. One, that there are certain forms, cultural forms and forms of consciousness which people ascribe to the diaspora, which I try to show actually existed in Lebanon before people migrated. But the second is, of course, once people migrated, because as we know in anthropology, we have the concepts that allow us to think the fact that people are constantly coming in and back and etc. So it's not a one-way direction, migration. And so once the initial propelment outside of the country has happened, of course, it becomes a transnational network of people who are influenced by Lebanon just as much as they are influencing Lebanon.
So the Lebanese capitalist modernity is one inherently tied to this scattering and one to which diasporic is not an effect. The diasporic condition is not an effect, but rather something that characterizes it. Can I ask you what is the modern here? Why is it about modernity? This definition of the diaspora that you're thinking with, can it be applied, let's say, by our archaeologist colleagues or historian colleagues in a more transhistorical way as well? Or indeed, is what you're describing as the diasporic condition something specific to capitalism, specific to modernity, and to some extent also specific to the Lebanese condition, probably also to many other?
Okay. Maybe the best way to deal with this is to look at a couple of different case studies of what this migratory movement or this mobility concerns. I mean, I think most people take it for granted that European capitalism and European modernity inherently included population movements. Mainly, it is imagined, at least not for researchers, but in general, it is imagined that it involves movement from the countryside to the city and a process of proletarianization where peasants become laborers in industry. So that's a modern phenomenon or modern capitalist phenomenon. That is, capitalism cannot be thought in Europe without that movement. Now, take another form of movement. France colonized Algeria. In the process, you have Algerian migration to Paris mainly first, but to other centers. This is what we might call a colonial diaspora. That is, it's a diaspora that goes back to the colony. Now, in Lebanon, you have an interesting thing. The French colonized Lebanon. They had a mandate, what's called a mandate. But in return, you don't see a movement of Lebanese solely to France.
Yeah.
Although Lebanese capitalism is inconceivable without French capitalism, French interest in Lebanese silk production, or it's a long story. So what I'm trying to capture is precisely this point, which I think is incredibly amazing. If you know the geographical topography of the Lebanese mountain, it's very, very rough terrain, made of big mountains, villages. Lots of the villages are autarkic, have a long history of not even meeting each other, and they're so autarkic they develop phenotypes and accent.
And endogamous, probably, for endogamous villages, probably.
And absolutely. And so what is interesting is this. At one point in history, a villager gets up and says, I'm not going to make a living here. But he or she doesn't say, I'm going to go to the city next to me. He says, I'm going to go to Nova Scotia. Think about this. Think about the consciousness that is needed. So we're not talking about the fact that there's already migrants there. Of course, once there is migration, it's sort of like you go where people are. But I'm interested in that origin where there's a transformation. That's what I call the change which involves the internationalization of the space of viability. That is, you're trying to make a life that's worth living for yourself. And you think, okay, I'm going to make it in a village. Maybe I'm going to make it in the city next to my village. But this internationalization of the space of viability, which involves not just a consciousness of the whole world, which already existed in Lebanon because of its long history of interaction, but a consciousness of the whole world as a place where you can make a living.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the scattering is no longer just the France, etc. So what you see in the 19th century is the Lebanese going to Brazil, the Lebanese going to, indeed, Nova Scotia, Queensland, in Australia. These are, they go to all other normal places, but I'm trying to capture places which you think, how can a villager in the bottom of this mountain suddenly think, okay, I'm going to go carry a suitcase and sell silk products in Texas by walking around. It's quite an amazing leap of the consciousness. And that's why I want to capture it with a specificity of this diaspora. It's not...
So one would think an obvious question for established thought about diaspora would be, well, what are the causes of that peasant to wake up and say, I'm going to Nova Scotia? Or what are the causes that lead to scattering? What are the causes? You just mentioned a phrase that is quite central to your book, the scattering, the internationalization of the space of viability. So you're approaching it slightly different from any sort of like causal, simplistic argument. But I did want to come back to this phrase, internationalization of the space of viability. And thinking of your larger work, indeed, viability is a concept that you keep coming back to. You mentioned already that it refers to a viable life. What is a life that is worth living. Elsewhere, you call it a somehow minimally bearable life before life becomes unbearable. Can you help us think through this term, through viability, but also the internationalization of space availability, and how might that offer us a different sort of angle to approach the emergence of this diasporic condition?
Well, I mean, I think there's probably I can give you a little bit of an intellectual genealogy to this, and a little bit of my own inclination. But I think there's definitely the influence of Pierre Bourdieu here, in the sense that the notion of viability combines at the same time a desire to see the world through the eyes of the people living it. And so to say, I'm looking for a viable life. I mean, people not necessarily use the concept of viability, but you can see, any ethnography will see that sort of like, I think, and as I tried to do recently in a series of lectures I gave at Columbia, you can see all of anthropology as the study of of experiences of human viability. So we think, what is the best way to live? How do I make my life worth living? It's always implicit in macro and micro modes of existence. And what I have been influenced by Bourdieu in the sense that at the same time, I don't leave it to just this idea of how people experience it, because I take my position as a social scientist, as an anthropologist, seriously. And I say, well, the reasons why I'm a social scientist is obviously because I can see certain things from the position of social science, which others don't see. Otherwise, I'm not here just to make a recording of what people think and just produce it. So it's an interaction between how to respect people's desires and orientation, how to also say, okay, but I can see certain mechanisms that are happening which orient people. So the internationalization of space of viability, for instance, for me, obviously is historical in Lebanon, in the sense that you have during that era a greater exposition to what's happening in the world. You've got world fairs, etc. And the Jesuits, French Jesuits in Lebanon intensify their desire to plant schools and start competing with the Protestants. And so you have a competition between Protestant schools and Jesuit schools in Lebanon, and people are being educated about the world and what's happening in the world, and etc. And so people start developing what I call a comparative consciousness. In the sense of like, if I do X here, would it be as good as if I do it there?
So it's not just fantasy. It's not this idea I move to America and live the American dream. It's the relationship between the fantasy with actual experiences, with histories of migration, and how those square out to create possibilities.
Absolutely. I think, there is an element I sort of like talk about in the book, which I could have developed more actually, because I've been thinking about it a lot. It's a question of the fact that there is a statistical scientific belief, and there is a type of religious magical belief. And if you think, for instance, I'm going to go to the United States because 73% of the Lebanese who have gone to the United States have done well. This would be a statistical belief. But magical saintly belief is very different, because if you think of belief in miracles, like a lot of villagers in Lebanon believe that this saint or that saint if they're Christian, has performed miracles. Now, to believe in a miracle, you don't say, actually, I believe in St. Joseph because 76% of the times where he performed the miracle, it worked. People don't believe in miracles statistically. It's enough for them to hear a story once that St. Joseph succeeded in curing to believe. And it's a bit like this, because probably if you get the statistics of the history of migration, you will find a seriously not so wonderful history of success and etc. But the history of the success, the story of the success,
plays a key role,
guides you and make you believe in the possibility of
One
migration.
wonders also about the opposite, that stories of failure can also have a very powerful impact. And I can imagine in village communities, I mean, I worked on similar issues in northern Kenya with migration to coastal tourist resorts, and their tourist stories of both miraculous wealth that you can acquire overnight and the miraculous loss of that wealth were the most pronounced. Everything in the middle was less interesting.
Exactly, which is why, I mean, what you just said confirms even more the relation between migration and gambling.
Yes.
Because in gambling also you have this discourse where I lost so much money and I made so much money, and anything in between is not sublime.
Less worth a story. To return a bit more centrally to one of the concepts that you develop in the book, it has to do with this idea that being in one place or another is not just about being in that one place, but all the other places that one could be in or has been in shape all the other. So one inhabits multiple realities at once. If I'm in the diaspora working, I'm also somehow at home, and vice versa. And you refer to this term, to this kind of idea using the term of lenticularity, which I think comes from these lenticular images that can offer you multiple kind of depictions depending on the angle. And when you switch the angle, the image shifts. Why is this an important point to remember? Why is it important to think beyond this separation, categorical separation? I mean, that's a diaspora, that's a home nation. Why emphasize that?
Well, there's two things. Sort of like one thing is ethnographic and about capturing reality in a more complex manner. In the sense that there is a dominant discourse, which just because it's dominant, it doesn't mean it's incorrect, but it's dominant. What I think, when you critique something dominant, not because it's incorrect for me, but because it becomes like a straitjacketing. Everybody thinks it this way. And so to critique it is not to say it's not correct. It's to say, okay, let's try and think about something else. Maybe it's possible to think differently. And so the dominant discourse has to do with the idea that if, let's take the classic case of homesickness in anthropological analysis of homesickness, it always involves a subject which is somewhere, and the subject is remembering somewhere else. And so you have this duality between you can be in one place, and if another place is pulling you, it's because you're remembering it. So I go through quite a lot of analytic gymnastics to show that this conception is dominated by temporal conceptions of memory. Because, homesickness is often associated with the irretrievable past. But with diasporic memory and diasporic homesickness, you're not just remembering a past, you're remembering another place. Now, of course, and you don't have to do anthropology to know that this other place is also imagined in time. So, like sometimes migrants imagine their village, and there's plenty of stories where they go back and they are disappointed. It's not like that has changed over time, and all of this. So there's always the work of time inside. But what is important is that remembering time is remembering another place is not the same as remembering another time. And so I was trying and highlight that, and highlight the fact that, well, there are many instances ethnographically where people were telling me they were not just sitting there in Montreal and remembering Lebanon. They were actually in Montreal and in Lebanon. And this idea of living in two spaces simultaneously, because we have a lot of theorization of diaspora in multiple places, but I'm interested in theorizing the simultaneous inhabitants of multiple places. That's what I spend quite a bit of time and energy trying to explain, that it's possible without making someone look like seriously weird, to argue that people can exist in multiple places. Now, the lenticularity is very important for me, because it's not just that you see things from a different angle with the lenticular. Everything you look at, if you look at it from one angle, you see it differently, etc. What's interesting about lenticular images is that the plurality of worlds that the image offers are already in
that single image. Yeah.
It's in the image, and your relation is not just your subjectivity that makes you see something different. It's your relation to the image which bring forth one of the multiple realities that are existing in the image. So the lenticularity is more associated with what we call ontological perspectivism. It brings out real pluralism. The plurality is a plurality of realities that is in a piece, not just plurality of perspectives on the reality. And that's what I wanted to highlight, to bring out the idea of multiple inhabitants. What does it mean? But of course, as anthropologists, we need to pluralize our conception of inhabitants. We are better at doing this than other disciplines. Because if you have one idea of how to inhabit a place, of course, you say, that doesn't make sense, I mean, like I'm now in Switzerland, don't give me a break, you're going to tell me I'm in Switzerland, I'm in Germany. Yeah, obviously, sort of like, let's smoke a joint and think it this way. No, I mean, if we think this way, obviously, but you have to be able to think that there are different ways of inhabiting. Right. You're not only restricted to one way of inhabiting and remembering.
And that's probably also the unique sort of vantage point of an ethnographic approach, where you can carefully tease out the relationship of body and space through memory and temporality and objects and all kinds of things.
Actually, I think I feel privileged as an ethnographer to have been able to spend so much time. I mean, that's the other thing. It's. I mean, if I like to think of my book also as a fly in the face of all those who want the quick research and quick products.
Absolutely.
Because it's a book where I've taken my time,
And to underscore just how powerful the imagination is, that comes out of that slow but deep engagement with life as lived. And that brings me to one of the last question that I have, as we're running out of time, but a really important one. Questioning dominant notions of the diaspora, let's say, is not just simple exercise of imagination. It could be also a political act. And here I wanted to ask you about how you think about the role of the intellectual, in particular the anthropologist, or really any scholar working with the ethnographic imagination today. And how do you see our role in relation to contemporary politics in inhabiting and possibly shaping this diasporic condition?
There is a very interesting move that many critical anthropologists have done throughout history, which are classical anthropologists. It's the idea that when you do ethnography, you try to capture something which is unusual. And in my case, it's an advertisement for saying you don't have to go to an island to capture something unusual. You can actually find things unusual wherever you do your research. But if you go to an island, that's fine, right? I have no problem with that personally. I think people put it down a bit too much. But the idea is this, that an ethnography refines your gaze. So when you think of when Marcel Mauss was doing an analysis of gift, you can say he looked at societies where gift exchange was dominant. He could have stopped there and said, our society is dominated by commodities, these societies are dominated by gift exchange. But he didn't stop there. He said, now that I've looked at all these societies where there's gift exchange, my gaze has changed into where I exist. I can see that we're not dominated by commodities. I can see that there are gift exchange in the here and now, which we call. So the ethnography refines your senses and allows you to see possibilities and realities that exist that are somehow obscured by dominant realities. It helps you. I think that's a very important function of the ethnographer. I would say one more important thing here is that it is important that we bring a politics that is the product of the ethnography. I think there is too many people who are importing the problematics of the political into anthropology as a way of doing politics, rather than people saying, I'm an anthropologist. What is it that is new that I can add to the political? Not how can I just adhere to this politics or this politics Absolutely. Or this politics.
So rather than bring the terms of the politics into anthropology and not question the terms, starting the other way around somehow. For our audience, if you are interested to learn more about the topics discussed in this episode, please check out Ghassan Hage's book, The Diasporic Condition. Ghassan, I want to thank you very much for your time and insightful conversation. And we look forward to discussing and being inspired by your work in the future as well.
Thank you very much for having me here.